are Jewish, but can we define their artwork as Jewish? As a group, they are not creating ceremonial objects or illuminating Haggadot or Ketubot or any other text at all. Rather, it is their striving, I think. They're striving for harmony, their emphasis on education, and their continual questioning of the human purpose that causes us to consider their work as highlights of their Jewish identity. But in the end, it's up to each of us, up to the viewer that looks at the work to decide if these artists have expressed their heritage in their work. I'd like to express my thanks to all of the Sisterhood for their support and encouragement to present this program, especially the efforts of Susanna Pawlowski, and for the Sisterhood President Claire Brooks for supporting this effort. I'm going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes on these 5 different women artists, and then open up for questions that you might have. And I appreciate you being on mute. I thank you for that. But please throw some of your questions into the chat as we progress. So I'm going to share my screen and start a PowerPoint. And if anybody's having trouble seeing or have any difficulty in hearing me, if you'll contact Susanna, and Susanna, if you just text me, I have my phone next to me, but it's on quiet, so it won't disturb us, okay? So we're gonna start alphabetically. We're gonna be looking at Lee Bontecou, and just for curiosity's sake, I want you to know she's the only artist that we're going to look at that's still alive. She was born in 1931. Helen Frankenthaler, who lived from 1928 to 2011. Lee Krasner, from 1908 to 1984. Louise Nevelson, from 1899 to 1988. And Charlotte Salomon, who lived the shortest period of time, who died at 26, from 1917 to 1943. So we're going to do this alphabetically. And so first we're going to start with Lee Bontecou, who was born in Providence, Rhode Island. Her parents were very much involved with the World War II effort. Lee was considered a kind of bridge between painting and sculpture. So her work is really kind of fascinating when you take a look at it. She has described her own sculpture as war equipment with teeth, but she was equally talented as a draftsperson, drawing, as well as an assembler or a sculptor, and putting things together. I mentioned that her parents were involved in World War II. Her mother wired transmitters for submarine navigation, which is kind of fascinating. So think of that word wire for a minute as we look at her work, because so much of it relies on wires. And her father sold gliders for the military. And so some of her work, as we start to look at it, you'll see kind of reminds you of something that has to do with outer space or flight or even Star Wars. As we look at this, you'll see what I'm talking about. But she did a lot of work with found objects. Now let's take a look at some of the pieces. In her early drawings, you can see she starts working with something that is kind of like an eye or an opening, an ocular. She was trained at the Art Students League, where she studied under a very famous sculptor named William Zorach. And she also studied at the Skowhegan School in Maine. But what's really fascinating, to me personally, and perhaps to you as well, is that when she got a Fulbright scholarship, she studied in Rome with Alexander Calder. And so you might see some of that influence towards the later pieces that we're going to look at. She used a lot of recycled materials that she found. She used soot for this drawing. So in some of her sculptures, she was using a torch, and the output of the torch created just a lot of dirt and soot, and she used that material as a drawing material. So this looks three-dimensional, but it is not. This is a drawing on paperboard. And so there are both organic forms and mechanical forms in Lee's work, which I think creates this kind of duality. You see these two things coming together, and this opening that repeats over and over and over again, which of course has caused some art historians to consider her work feminist, thinking that that opening is kind of like a feminine genitalia. But for me, I see it more like outer space. So take a look, if you will, at this detail and look at the stitching that's going on. These are pieces of burlap. These are old postal bags. All of the materials that she's using are found objects, different colors of burlap and materials that she stitched together, and sometimes colored with the soot that she used to weld all of the armature. You can see the sort of web, which becomes almost like girders of a building. And then there's that opening that repeats again and again. Let's take a look at another. Most of the work from this time period is her most famous. So she was working from like 1958 to 1960. And during this time period, thas works were both that bridge that I talked about between painting and sculpture, and also a bas-relief. So for those of you that are not familiar, a bas-relief is something that is flat on one side and protrudes out from the wall. The first time I saw Lee's work was at the Menil collection in 1914, and wait, not 1914, 1974. No, that's not right either. Hold on, let me see what the date was when she was at the Menil. It's 2014, sorry. And what I was astounded by, not only was the fact that these things were protruding out, but that the opening seemed like outer space. It seemed like this giant void. And what she used in that opening was not more soot, but she found some of the velvet, black velvet that was used for theater sets, and placed the velvet in the back. And then these found objects that were welded together and stitched together to protrude out to create these forms that were both painterly and sculptural. So you can see what I was talking about, that flat on the back and then protruding out, almost like a pregnant woman's belly. But here you can see this young woman staring into this vacuous space, and it almost feels like something right out of Star Wars. The sense of mechanical appears in his work. At the same time, it seems very organic. So you've got machine and natural things coming together in this one form. One thing that's really interesting about Lee is that she became a recluse. In the 1970s, she stopped doing interviews. She moved from her home. She was teaching at the Brooklyn College, but she moved to Pennsylvania. I think she's now living in Florida. But she was very much a recluse, and even had her own helicopter. If she had to get to a show in New York, she would take the helicopter there. She won the praise of a number of very famous sculptors. Donald Judd wrote that her work asserts its own existence in form and power and becomes an object in its own right. Let's take a look here. You can see the kind of repetition of the fragments of form that she uses that create this kind of circuitous circumference for the ocular in the center. And here in this last piece that I'll show you, she started doing these sculptures that were kind of like visions from outer space. So you can see in the detail, they're almost like bat wing forms that extend out. She put this together at nighttime. So all of the small little tiny orbs of round ceramic pieces would appear to be floating as if we were looking at some sort of solar system. And I think that, you know, she really had this unique vision and never wandered away from it, that the ocular is still there, the sense of both mechanical and organic form stayed with her for the remainder of her career. In contrast, let's take a look at Helen Frankenthaler. Some of you may be familiar with Frankenthaler's work. She stained her canvases. She took oil paint and thinned it down with a great deal of turpentine, and then used alternative tools to spread the paint around, to move the paint around. She is considered an abstract expressionist artist, and I think one of the leaders of the art field movement, in which other artists in the color field movement, I should say, followed in her footsteps by staining the canvas. So she highly influenced artists like Kenneth Nolan and Morris Louis, but it was the influence on her of Jackson Pollock that got her to start painting on the floor, to move the paint around. She was very much involved with the art scene in New York. She was influenced by Hans Hofmann. Clement Greenberg was an important critic at the time, and she had an affair with him for about 5 years, and then wound up marrying Robert Motherwell, who was another artist, abstract expressionist. Some of you may know Motherwell's works, big white canvases with big splotches of black paint, beautiful movement in her work. But the soak stain technique is something that is Frankenthaler's alone. And she tried very much to kind of capture the sense of land, of water, and of sky, not trying to illustrate it, but to capture the feeling of it. This is her most famous painting, Mountains and the Sea. So take a look at some of the lyrical lines that she is creating with the charcoal on top of the oil. So this is unsized canvas. So what do I mean by that? It has not been primed. There's no gesso on it, which creates practically a danger for people who are trying to conserve the paintings, because the oil paint sinks in to the fibers of the canvas and eventually will eat it through unless it is properly preserved. But you can see the gesture, right? The gesture of water, the sense of movement of the spray of water, which was very much a part of her life. She studied with a muralist, Rufino Tamayo, and so scale became a very important part of her work, large scale imagery. She also had a lot of experience with Hans Hofmann as well. When I said that she married Robert Motherwell, she was married to him for 13 years. She did remarry. Somebody needs to mute their sound, please. Taking care of that. This work is called Swan Lake. So if you look carefully, this is one of the few pieces by Frankenthaler where you actually can see a recognizable form. Take a look at the white areas created by the blue paint. You can kind of see the swan shapes in there. And she also was using a kind of defined cube in the brown paint that kind of created the border for her. So much of the emphasis in Frankenthaler's work happens in the center of the canvas rather than the outside edges. So if you look to the center, you really see the meat of where the action is going, where the movement of the paint is going. And knowing that she was painting abstractly helps you to understand that she was looking at organic shapes, fluid shapes, and very colorful shapes. So unlike Lee Bontecou, who is working with organic shapes, these shapes are brightly colored, very saturated, very, very intense. But one thing that's different about Frankenthaler's use of both acrylic and oil is that she tried to get the color to be less opaque, more transparent by adding, in the case of oil, adding turpentine, and in the case of acrylic paint, adding mediums to it, and water, so that it would become much more fluid, almost like watercolor in a way. So she is looking at these large fields, areas of color, and capturing the sense of motion. Here you can actually see in these layers, these bands of color, a feeling for water, for earth, for mountain, for sky, and for sun, all of that kind of coming together. This piece called Flood, which really has a kind of fluid nature to it. And here something is starting to happen. So she was studying the work of Matisse and Cézanne and looking at some of the areas where white space was left to kind of open up the picture plane. And here again, you can see that fluidity. Take a look at the greens and how they change from being opaque at the top section where it's really, really dark, and then opening up to a much more translucent and liquid looking kind of color. When she first saw the work of Jackson Pollock, she had some interesting things to say. To see Pollock's work, I think, really changed a lot of artists who were in New York in the 50s and 60s. To see that kind of overall kind of painting without a central focus, without a place to start, it was considered kind of a very radical kind of thing, and especially because he was painting on the floor. So Frankenthaler says, "It was all there. I wanted to live in this land. I had to live there and master the language. A really good picture looks as if it happened all at once. It's an immediate image. For my own work, when a picture looks labored and overworked and you can read in it, well, that doesn't work for me." So she was very excited about being exposed to Pollock's work. And here you can see the influence of that. Later in her career, Frankenthaler got very interested in printmaking, and she was collaborating with a number of artists. One, a gentleman named Kenneth Tyler. In 1961, she was working with the Universal Limited Art Editions lithographic workshop in Long Island. And she began to explore what woodcut would do and how woodcut could kind of capture the texture and the lucidity and the fluid quality of the kind of painting that she was doing. You can see that this edition had 14 artist proofs, so she was going through lots of trials, but you should know that it took many, many blocks, like 46 blocks, to achieve this kind of color variation and change. On the Tales of Genji, some of you may be familiar with Lady Murakami's story of love and life in Japan. But this really tells a tale more of landscape. You get this feeling of the beautiful, rich blues, but you definitely get a feeling of landscape because of the horizon line. So really all it takes is that one linear element of horizon to give you a definition of land versus sky. Here's another example of that trend of trying to look at very, very soft, translucent color. And this one, many of you may look at this and see what I see, because this one reminds me very much of Rothko. It has a kind of moody quality to it as the blues and the purples kind of come together. Mm-hmm. Here's another example of that kind of moodiness. This one a little bit more definitive in the defined kind of dot shapes down at the bottom, but that mass up at the top and that combination of the whites and blues, those are really beautiful. And that's really what she was striving for by using alternate tools. So she wasn't just using brushes. There are times when she was painting, and this is really large, 71 by 144 inches, painting on the floor, using mops, using alternative kinds of rakes and things to push the paint around. Let's take a look at another one. Here is another woodcut, this one with 102 colors and again 46 blocks. This one is her interpretation of Madame Butterfly. And if you think back to the first image we saw of mountains and the sea, where there were lyrical lines, she's got some of that in that white area where you see that linear circular mark and then the line that goes through, but this combination of loose, translucent qualities of paint and then linear elements that sit over top. I'd like to show you a brief interview about Frankenthaler. So this one, just take a few minutes and enjoy.
Rita Braver has a portrait of the artist. This morning, abstract expressionist Helen Frankenthaler. The beauty of Provincetown, Massachusetts on Cape Cod inspired many work of the most renowned American artist of the 20th century, Helen Frankenthaler. But though you may notice shimmering ocean blues and tawny shades of sand in her work, don't expect to find recognizable landscapes. It was the feeling of a place that she was trying to evoke in abstract expressionist style. Take this painting called Beach.
It's painted with paint and plaster of Paris and coffee grounds and sand. And so it evokes our sitting on the deck with her drinking her cup of coffee and walking on the beach with the sand, crunching it under your feet. It captures the whole experience of a day with Ellen. So this is Provincetown Bay.
Lise Motherwell is Frankenthaler's stepdaughter from her 1958 marriage to another famed artist, Robert Motherwell. Though the couple would ultimately divorce, Lise stayed close to Frankenthaler over the years.
So the second story was Helen's studio. The third story was my father's studio. And the downstairs was a beach house. And
she says Frankenthaler was exuberant about life as well as art.
Helen was incredibly playful. Everything is an adventure. Let's try it. And that was really exciting to be around.
It's always a pleasure.
And now a series of works that Helen Frankenthaler created in Provincetown is on view at the Parish Art Museum in Watermill on Long Island. The exhibit is called Abstract Climates because co-curator Elizabeth Smith says that's how Frankenthaler described what she was trying to create in paintings like Cool Summer. It's almost a little bit psychedelic looking.
Yeah, the palette is so bright. You know, the blues, the greens, the pinks, the reds, the yellow. And we can almost in this painting get the sensation of a cool breeze on a hot summer day.
Born in 1928 into a wealthy New York family, Frankenthaler started painting in high school and studied art at Bennington College. In 1951, she had her first solo exhibition. If my count is right, she was 23 years old.
Yes, and she also, that same year, was included in the 9th Street show. And that was the first time that a large number of artists who would later become known as the abstract expressionists of the New York School were exhibited all together.
Frankenthaler struck up a romance with Clement Greenberg, considered the leading art critic of his time. He introduced her to one of the most audacious artists of the moment, Jackson Pollock. As Frankenthaler explained in a 1978 documentary, Pollock's technique of pouring paint onto canvases on the floor changed everything for her.
You sit up when you paint a picture and it is facing you closely. No, you're waltzing all around it and it's on the floor.
But while Pollock splattered the paint, layering it onto the canvas in a three-dimensional way, Frankenthaler developed a flatter style of painting that she called soak stain.
She took oil paint and thinned it down with turpentine kerosene to almost watery consistency, and she let it spill and pour along the surface of the painting.
This seems to be a Frankenthaler moment. There are also major exhibits of her work in Venice and at the Princeton University Art Museum in New Jersey. It's a far cry from 1952 when she first showed this piece called Mountains and Sea. Today, it's considered a masterpiece, but back then,
I don't think people really, immediately understood what she was doing. And in fact, when she showed the painting in at her gallery, it didn't sell. And I think it was on sale for $100 or something like that. So it went back to live with Helen in her studio.
It now hangs in the National Gallery of Art. And long before her death in 2011,
I would definitely want that in the show.
Right.
Helen Frankenthaler would see the prices of her paintings soar and her work celebrated. But as she told Sunday Morning in 1984, she could never explain how she made the magic.
People say to me, how do you feel in the middle of making a picture? I can't answer. I think something takes over. You're lost in it.
The next artist that we're going to take a look at, Lee Krasner, was also, of course, influenced both positively and negatively by Jackson Pollock. She was married to Pollock. They met in 1941. He was both an alcoholic and unfaithful, so it was not a very positive experience, obviously, for her in many ways, because she has been forced to kind of live in his shadow. The quote from Hans Hofmann about her work was, "So good, you would not know it was done by a woman." And so Lee kind of lived under that pressure. Her name at birth was Lena. She was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish home in Brooklyn, a large population, of course, there of Jewish immigrants. Her father spent most of his time practicing Judaism while her mother kept up the household and the family business. Lee practiced her Hebrew. She was very much involved in her Jewish life. But she, as a teenager, felt that there was some sort of negative misogyny in Orthodox Judaism. She was reading the prayer, "Thank you, O God, for creating me in your image." And as a woman, the person would say, "Thank you, O God, for creating me as you saw fit." And so she began to kind of turn away from her Jewish practice. In fact, when she married Pollock, they married in a church, although she still identified as a Jewish artist. They both exhibited together, and take a look at, this is a very early self-portrait, but when you look at the work that she did in the early portion of her career, you can see the relationship to Pollock. You can see the sense of overall painting, but if it was Pollock, obviously there would be drips, but these are organic forms that are layered one on top of another. So there was a great deal of interchange between Pollock's work and Krasner's work. Let's take a look at another one. So you can see that something's starting to change for her. You can see that the shapes are starting to become a little bit more defined, not like just drips or overall painting, but individual organic shapes that are kind of coming out from the picture plane. I want to tell you that Krasner was very critical of herself and very picky, and she burnt a lot of her work. She would set fire to it, or she would cut it up into pieces. And that's sort of a jumping off point. So here we can see the beginning of the departure with Polar Stampede, where the shapes are opening up a little bit. They're not so dense, although it's still kind of an overall painting where there is no beginning and no end. You can't really see the start of where these forms are coming from. The forms are wider and more open than they had been before. And here even more so. But again, the repetition of kind of creature-like forms, animal-like shapes. She was still identified as an abstract expressionist and using, for the most part, a polychromed kind of canvas. And then she started cutting up pieces of canvas that she rejected and collaging them together and creating patterns, lots and lots of different patterns in her work. Here we can take a look at another. So these are very strong chromatically. You can see the intensity of the complementary color she was using, the intense blues and the oranges together, and then bits and pieces of canvas, both canvas that was painted on, canvas that was not painted on. And this collage and painting combination really became her signature style. And it's also important to notice that Pollock, who was trained by Thomas Hart Benton, had a kind of Baroque approach to the composition. By that, I mean, if you look at some of Benton's paintings, there's a kind of circular composition, which kind of led itself to Pollock walking around the canvas and dripping in a circular way to cover every surface. Not the case in terms of the training that Krasner had. She studied with Hans Hofmann, and she was looking at the two-dimensional surface of the picture plane and letting color create the three-dimension. So those two artists, although they were married, lived together and influenced each other, took different avenues. Here you can see the intense color of some of her later works that are really so bright and so fabulous. But again, a combination of, you can see the three-dimensionality of the very pink. I've got my cursor on this pink area right here, where you can see this part was cut out and applied, and here as well, and here as well. So that combination of painting and collage really took Krasner to a different place, and to be something other than just Mrs. Jackson Pollock. I have an interview that I'd like to share with you. But the quote that she said, which I thought was really interesting, is that she wanted the canvas to breathe and to be alive and to have a life all of its own. And you can see from the intense color that it really does jump and come alive. Here's another. I begin to see some of the influence of different cultures. You can see Native American influence in some of these forms and patterns that she was working with as well. Here, let's hear from Lee in her own words. I don't know. Here we go.
I think all painting is biographical. I think you can read any artist. Painting is biographical. If you take the trouble to read any artist, if you take the trouble to. The first approval comes in this form. This is so good, you would not know it was done by a woman. Yeah.
I once had that said to me.
Yeah.
It's the most peculiar feeling.
Yeah, I mean, if you put it beautifully, it's a most, you don't know quite what to do with the damn. First approval comes in this form. This is so good, you would not know it was done by a woman. Heavy, heavy. What do you mean?
Trying to get into your head when you're standing there in front of that wall.
Mm. You just take a deep breath and hope for the best and get into it. And sometimes
We're gonna stop there. It looks like there were two versions of that film that were playing at the same time, so I apologize. But one of the things that Krasner had to fight was, of course, that prejudice of being compared to Jackson Pollock. So here we move on to another artist who was influenced by Hans Hofmann, but who also was deeply influenced by her upbringing and by the city of New York. So the flamboyant and fabulous Louise Nevelson, born in 1899 and known for her monochromatic wall pieces, also bas-relief, kind of like Lee Bontecou, but very different. She was born Leah Berliowski in the Russian Empire, known now as the present-day Ukraine, and her family emigrated to the United States in the early 20th century and wound up in Rockland, Maine, of all places. Her father had a lumber yard, and so Nevelson was surrounded by wood all the time, scraps of wood, pieces of wood, and so forth. And wood, of course, figures prominently in her life. Her mother, who was an immigrant, tried to make up for that fact by dressing very flamboyantly, and henceforth Louise did also. She was certainly known for her artwork, but also known for dressing flamboyantly with scarves and 3 layers of false eyelashes and incredible jewelry, which she designed herself. She learned English at school and she spoke Yiddish at home. They were a very traditional family. She studied also at the Art Students League in New York as a student of Hans Hofmann and Chaim Gross. She experimented with conceptual art, and she was very, very ambitious. She began working as a stenographer at a local law firm in New York, where she met a man named Bernard Nevelson, co-owner with Bernard's brother Charles of a shipping business. She fell in love with Charles and married him, and they had a Jewish wedding. and they were married in Boston. And the family was very satisfied that Louise married into a traditional Jewish family. But she began to study painting and drawing. She did have a child. She gave birth to Myron in 1922. They later called him Mike, and he grew up to be a sculptor. But despite the approval of this marriage, she was very unhappy. And she said that, quote, "My husband's family was terribly refined. With that circle, you could know Beethoven, but God forbid you were Beethoven." So the family moved to Mount Vernon, New York, and Louise wanted none of it. And she divorced her husband. She left to study with Hans Hofmann in France and in Italy. She returned to New York, where she studied at the Art Students League again and met Diego Rivera and had an affair with him, which caused a rift with her friendship with Frida Kahlo, of course. She also studied, I mentioned before, with Chaim Gross, who influenced her work greatly. So let's take a look at some of the wooden assemblages that Nevelson put together. By combing through the streets of New York, she found scraps and pieces of furniture and pieces of wood that she put together and painted in a monochrome fashion, again in bas-relief form, and that is that one side was flat and the other protruding into the space of the viewer. This one she painted completely white. This one's called Dawn's Wedding. You can see a detail of it. And so what she did was reclaim objects that were thrown away. She was recycling, just like Lee Bontecou was, but taking materials that were found objects and transforming them, making them into something else. Here you can see she started working with Corten steel. She was using a foundry to create some of her larger pieces. And this one created called Windows to the West, also known as Atmosphere and Environments, in which you could see large open areas where you could see the environment in which pieces were placed. So that's kind of an exciting thing to see. Here, a piece that she did in homage to the 6 million lost in the Holocaust. So Nevelson, unlike some of the artists that we have looked at, actually made some pieces that were either connected to her Jewish culture or religious in nature. Here's the Bema Wall Temple of Bethel in Great Neck, New York. This one is called The White Flame of the 6 Million. And so you can see how this connects to some of the other work that she was doing with the repetition of wooden forms and the open spaces. And here, an addition to Temple Israel in Boston on the outside of the building. This one again, Corten steel. And then she was commissioned to do a Lutheran church, the Church of the Good Shepherd, St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Manhattan. And when someone asked her, you know, how is it possible that a Jewish woman would create something for a church? She said, God is not a Lutheran. I don't think the background of the artist is as important as the inspiration. So I certainly identify with her. I've been asked to do a Christmas card for St. Agnes Academy in Houston, and being Jewish, I had to learn all about Mary and Joseph and all of that. But the idea that inspiration really doesn't have a religion, that inspiration and connection to God is sort of universal. Here you can see this particular piece is in Houston. Some of you may recognize the Enron building behind Frozen Laces 1. And this one very much following in the tradition of monochrome. So I think that there were really three colors that Nevelson used, either painting pieces all black, all white, or gold. She had kind of a Baroque period where she painted pieces all gold, and then the Corten steel, which was its own color. And then in 2000, there was a stamp created in her honor that recognized all of her contribution to the feminist movement and to art history. And so you can see some examples of her work on these stamps. I do have another video. And Susanna, do you think we have enough time to see? It's about a 7-minute video. Should we skip it? I can't hear you, so unmute yourself.
Show it.
Should we show it? Okay, I'll tell you what, I'll show a little bit of it and cut it short so that we can look at Charlotte Salomon and get to the questions. So she was very eccentric and lots of fun. And
Louise Nevelson is a superstar in the world of art. Her picture glares out at us from the covers of art magazines. She's had art books written about her. Louise Nevelson belongs, in a sense, to New York City, but in another sense, New York City belongs to her. Her pieces of sculpture fill this square, their forms shadow black against the skyline. All over the city, you can find her work, outside and in. In this case, Chapel of the Good Shepherd beneath the Citicorp skyscraper in Manhattan. She seems as much a part of New York as the buildings themselves. In the World Trade Center hangs one of her big wall sculptures, Skygate, New York. It's one of the many Nevelsons adorning the walls of Wall Street, where it seems every little freeze, it seems to whisper Louise. But Louise Nevelson, for all those New York connections, does not come from the big town, but from a little town called Rockland, Maine. Her family brought her here from Russia when she was 3 years old. And here, along Penobscot Bay, Louise Berliowski grew up. It wasn't wonderful, to tell the truth, growing up as a Russian Jewish immigrant kid in a small New England town at the turn of the century. Attitudes were as rock-bound as the coastline that gives the town its name. Yet her brother, Nate, has stayed here all his life. Their mother and father are buried here now. And last weekend, something brought Louise back home, too.
If this isn't an ego trip for that, for me.
It was Louise Nevelson Day in Rockland. The Farnsworth Museum, which didn't exist when Louise was growing up, turned from its usual displays of American traditionalists and ship models to show for the first time the work of one artist only, and that artist was Louise Nevelson.
From the minute I ever showed anything in the 1930s, I was recognized, and the critics have been wonderful.
Some of the pieces her brother Nate has held on to over the years. And with pieces from other collections, they trace the evolution of Louise Nevelson from the small town to the big time.
I never wanted to make anything for anybody. I really wanted to have an unfoldment in myself. I made everything for myself because I wanted to realize, what is this world? What am I doing here? Where am I connected? And that was an important thing.
Many things in Rockland are the same as they were when she grew up. There are 8,000 people here now. There were 8,000 then. Young Louise used to walk along the beaches, picking up pieces of flotsam and jetsam, dreaming of things that might have been and of things that could be. And maybe it was back here, back then, that the soul of the artist began to take shape. Desire to make things out of bits and pieces, chair legs and stair banisters and picture frames.
To make something big with a lot of nothing, really. No one else could make a barrel stay sing, I don't believe. And they do. They're really listening for the almost. Many people, are not. They didn't think of it as the art it is. I'm sure I didn't. I'm ashamed.
I know you and I have met somewhere, and I don't know where. But it's wonderful to see you again. This is wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. It's a great occasion, Carl. Thank you very much.
When she left here, it was without regret. And she's admitted that the place was much more to her than a dot on a map. And yet, here she was, at the age of 80, looking and dressing not at all the way 80-year-old women are supposed to look or dress in Rockland or anywhere else for that matter.
okay, we're going to move on because of time. And the last artist that we're going to look at is the work of Charlotte Salomon. Charlotte was a young woman who was caught in the web of the Nazis. Sadly, she died at the age of 26. She was born in Berlin and created over 1,000 pieces. We have about 769 of the pieces that she created during a 2-year period, really a 3-year period, but from 1941 to 1943. Her family was a wealthy family. Her father was a surgeon, but there was a great deal of sadness in her family. A number of people in her family committed suicide. Her mother, her great-grandmother, her great-uncle, and a cousin. And so she wanted to try to capture the emotions of her life and the feeling of her life in a short period of time when she and her family fled to France near Nice to escape the Nazis. She did have a great deal of art training before then. She did fall in love. And when she was finally captured by the Nazis, she was pregnant and she was killed in Auschwitz and gassed along with her baby. But in that 2-year period, she created a massive work that captured her life in the medium of gouache, which is a water-based paint, kind of like acrylic, but more opaque. It has the same binder as watercolor, so it's gum arabic, but it's also mixed with chalk and glycol and a couple of other things. So it's a very opaque paint. And she created a series called Life or Theater. And it was simply a documentary of everything that she had experienced in her life as a way to cope with what she was experiencing. She was the caretaker of her grandfather, and sadly, her grandfather sexually abused her. But you can see in the imagery, she captured the terror and the frustration and the horror of life in both Nazi-occupied Germany and France during this time period. So we'll take a look at a couple of other of her pieces. Here she's showing her studies when she was studying at the American School in France, and she was studying art and learning about her technique. And here, this image has to do with the suicides of her grandmother and her mother. The suicide of her mother was kept from her until she was an adult. She thought her mother had died of the flu, but she is trying to capture as a young artist every experience that she had. And it was almost like a visual diary. In addition to the images, she also had music established to go along with it and text. So it was really what is considered to be a complete work of art in all forms, where she is trying to capture life. In a way, this whole series was compared to the Diary of Anne Frank. Marc Chagall made that comment that it was very much like Anne Frank, and you can see the figures have somewhat of a Chagall quality. Some of the figures appear to be flying or in motion. So she was trying to come to grips with the trauma of her life and all of the terror of living under Nazi rule. So I will stop sharing and see if anyone has any questions. Thank you all for your attention, for listening, and for learning about these 5 artists who are so different in the way that they've expressed their Jewish heritage and their interests. And now there's a couple of questions. I actually don't, I have some comments that came to me privately, but no questions. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask?
Ellie, I'm struck by how non-traditional were all of these women in their own way. Personality, presentation, I mean, none of them really represented any of their times that they lived. And I'm sure that was, part of their creative activity, as well as a way to be, to be accepted, to be recognized, or to be identified. It's really very, very stunning to see, how
So different for sure. And most of them, we're looking at, artists who are working in the 20th century. And I would say the one that was the most narrative was Charlotte Salomon. The question came up from Leda, which one was my personal favorite? I think of all of them, I really gravitate towards Louise Nevelson, the innovative use of materials that are everyday objects that are transformed into something much more monumental, whether it's the leg of a chair or a box of fruit, all of that conformed into something different, which I find really fascinating. Are these artists represented in Houston? Definitely Nevelson is. I don't think that Charlotte Salomon's work is outside of Europe or has traveled outside of Europe to my knowledge. I know that Krasner is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and Frankenthaler, there may be some drawings of and some prints of Frankenthaler's in Houston. Let's see if there's any other questions. No other questions.
No, can you hear me?
Sure.
This is Joyce Goodman. I have several construction boxes of Nevelson's.
Oh, wow.
And for some reason, I think I met her through an art gallery here one time. I don't know. I think it's because she was such a strong character. And I have a Frankenthaler piece on paper. But my husband, who was a dentist, had a patient who came in one time, and they were talking about art. And this person said, oh, they were in art school with her, and that crazy woman, she used to go around and pick up all these pieces of wood and trash and put all these things together. There she was.
Yes, very eccentric and very interesting. Yes. And I think that, for each of those women, there was this battle between following a traditional household, getting married, yes, having children, and then following their careers. And I think that issue is still the case for many artists to decide how much time, do you devote to your career, how much to your family.
Yes.
I know that Nevelson left her son. She just left her son in order to pursue her career. And sometimes there are sacrifices that have to be made. We heard that Helen Frankenthaler stayed close to her stepdaughters through her entire life. And this was Robert Motherwell's children. They weren't even her real children or her stepchildren, which of course that's part of her family. But that's a tough choice, to kind of focus on the career. Most of the artists that we looked at, except for Charlotte Salomon, taught at some point in time. And I think that energy of working with other students and having ideas that go back and forth between the artist and the student is very, very helpful for both the student and the artist. I find that personally, that I get so much from the students that I work with.
Ellie, do you think that it is a little easier today for a young artist, for a woman artist to be established compared to the time when you started, or there are still significant barriers that are present?
Have you ever heard of the Guerrilla Girls?
Mm.
There were a group of women that actually dressed up, put gorilla masks on to protest the Museum of Modern Art not showing enough women artists. And their tagline was something like, do you have to be naked to get into the museum? So there's still a problem. There's still a barrier, I believe, in terms of, what are the prices paid for a painting by a man? And maybe Roberta, you can, Roberta, if you're still on, you can speak to this issue of the discrepancy between how men and women are treated. So we know that Lee Krasner stopped signing her name Leah and turned it to Lee, and then eventually used LK to sign paintings so that people would not judge the work that it was by a woman. There is in DC, Susie Askenaz just wrote that the Menil had a Guerrilla Girls protest. But today, I think with the internet, with people able to actually put their work out there and having viewers respond to the work immediately rather than trying to respond to the artist per se, evens the playing field a little bit. not 100%, but a little bit. I think it's a little bit easier to get the work out there. I was going to say that there is a museum of, a National Museum of Women in Washington, D.C. I was asked to be part of it, and I said no, because I didn't want to be identified as a woman artist. I wanted to be recognized as just an artist, and didn't want to be separated. You know, I didn't want the seat in the back of the bus, so to speak. Yeah.
Ellen, can you hear me? It's Roberta.
Yeah, thank you, Roberta. I appreciate you chiming in.
You know, the time that all of these women lived was a very special time during American history. And I think there was an enormous prejudice against women in general, you know, no matter what their field was, but certainly in the art area. And I think, you know, and I think one of the things that I wonder as I listened to your wonderful talk was just how much their Jewish spirit might have had to do with the way they continued and they carried on and their independence ultimately, because I think some people, Helen Frankenthaler probably had an easier time. She was born to a very wealthy family. She was involved with Clement Greenberg, who was like the major American critic at the time. And then she was married to Motherwell. So she was always involved in that circle that was very important and noticed, and it was like the magic click. But, you know, I think for the most part, they all had to struggle to really gain an identity. But it's the Jewish spirit that I wonder about, since, you know, you're talking about them as Jews and as women and on this special night of Hanukkah. So, you know, anyway, so that's kind of my question back to you, or to anybody.
Sure. I mean, it was a special time, and, you know, and I don't want to say anything negative about Helen Frankenthaler, but if you're going to sleep with somebody and have an affair, that's not a bad choice, you know, to pick an influential critic, you know, who could introduce you to the intelligentsia of the art world. And sometimes it is, you know, who you know and who you bump into, but the work certainly was solid. So, you know, this particular time in American history in the mid 20th century was pivotal for both visual art and for women. And so it's interesting, they were on the cusp of it. You know, certainly Charlotte Salomon's work sits away from that because she was obviously in Europe under the thumb of the Nazi regime. But the idea of trying to create something that communicates of great beauty without a recognizable subject matter is such a challenge. And for those people that think that abstract art is easy, I challenge you to try it, because it is very difficult. I love abstract art and I love realism, but abstract art is very hard. And Roberta, I know that you do that, and it is a big challenge. You have to really go deep inside of yourself to try to communicate something that isn't just a pretty paper or a pretty picture with paint just splattered on it, right? There's a whole lot more to it than that. I did not see the protest that the Guerrilla Girls had. I think that Sandy Seltzer Bryant wrote to me about it, but I don't remember actually seeing it for myself. Perhaps some of you did or experienced it, but I do know that Houston has a great and supportive art community, and we're really lucky to have such a great new facility like the Kinder Building to explore contemporary art and to take a look at it, the art of women and men. So any other questions out there?
Ellen, how were we able to save so many of Charlotte Salomon's works if she was killed at such a young age?
She gave the work to a trusted friend. She stayed, when she was in Nice, she stayed at a villa that was owned by an American, and she gave the work, she put it in a folder and gave it to a trusted friend to give to the woman that owned this villa. And she cared for them, saved them, and preserved them. And in addition to all of these like 759 drawings or whatever that of gouache paintings that were saved, there were overlays of text and instructions for music. And some of the music was like Mahler, and some of the music was folk songs, and some of them were Nazi marches. I mean, she really literally compacted an entire operetta form of all of her artwork and all of these words and all of the music together. It was truly a unique, complete and conceived work of art. So really fascinating. And what a loss at 26 years old to be so smart, so inventive, and to die so tragically. Very sad. Any other questions or thoughts or reactions to things that you've seen, or who wants to buy one? Yeah. Barbara, you're muted, so unmute yourself, Barbara.
Oh, you said who wants to buy one? I'm like, I do.
Which one would you buy, Barbara? Which one would you pick?
Well, I liked all of the contemporary ones and the pieces that were flat and then came out.
Oh, okay. The Bontecou sculptures or the Nevelson sculptures?
Well, actually, either or.
Either or, okay. The other thing that came to my mind as we were looking at these was the scale. And, you know, when you think of women artists, you think of, you know, somebody at an easel doing a little painting of a vase with some flowers or a couple pieces of fruit. And these women were working on a monumental scale. And that says something. I had this fabulous professor at NYU. His name was Keith Mayerson. And he said, and tongue in cheek, you know, we were doing critiques. He said, well, if you can't make it good, make it big. And if you can't make it big, make it red. And if you can't make it red, make it shiny. And he was talking about the commercial nature of the art world and, you know, what sells and what, and again, this was tongue in cheek because he was really trying to get us to be serious about our work. But the scale of the work that 4 of the 5 artists that we looked at was truly monumental, you know, bigger than life. You saw even, you know, the Frankenthaler and the Krasner pieces were enormous, just enormous physically, a challenge just to complete. And Roberta, I know you work in some large pieces and it's hard physically, especially as we age. You know, I'm working on some 6-foot paintings. I'm thinking, I'm too old for this. You know? Any other questions or thoughts that you want to share with the group before we say goodnight on this Hanukkah night?
At the Art Institute in Chicago, there's a Bontecou piece that when I was a little girl, my mother used to take me there, and it scared the hell out of me because of that huge black vast stone. And I thought it was going to swallow me up. I was 5 years old. And now I've come to love her work. It's just wonderful.
Well, it certainly has that vacuous sense where you think you're looking at either outer space or something that's going to swallow you up. But it definitely makes you think, for sure. Yeah.
Ellie.
Yeah.
Claire, but you can't see my picture, but I wanted to thank you so much. This was so educational, and that you showed the women artists, young and later years, and their painting with a mop. I mean, it was such a variety, and your clear description of it was really fantastic. And I thank you so much. And thank you, Susanna, for putting this all together.
Thank you.
Susanna and I have a love relationship, so you know it seemed like the perfect fit. Any other thoughts or questions?
I say thank you. This was delightful presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Well, good.
It was beautiful.
It was great.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Susanna, for doing such a wonderful job.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Happy last night of Hanukkah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Happy Hanukkah
all. And I remind you that we will get back with programs starting in January, and we will be doing cooking, studying Torah, all kind of different things. But Ellie, please keep us alert of when you are going to have your next exhibit, as well as your classes, which really have put some light into this time of quarantine and give us something to work and look forward and improve and even how to process some of the things that we went through art. And I can see some of my classmates that are in here to say thank you. Thank you for tonight and good night to you all.
Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Night. Hi, Marion Friedman. I see you.
Hi. Thank you so much for this.
It was so much fun. It was a pleasure to see you all. Take care.
You too, Ellen. Bye.